Let's see. Well, make sure, I know you're checking your student email account, and any announcement that I post, make sure you read the details. I gave an email where I talked about if I was a student taking my final midterm, how would I prepare for it? And make sure you take full advantage of the fact that I'm giving you PowerPoint slides with the notes underneath each slide. So a nice way to review, if I was reviewing for this midterm exam, is to go through and I gave you some broad categories, but those categories line up with certain places in our week's worth of lectures where you can say, oh, there's what he's talking about this, there's where he's talking about that. And just kind of like lightly read through the speaker notes, and it'll remind you of what we talked about in lecture, and then accentuate that with any notes that you've taken and kind of review that, and I think you'll be in good shape for the final midterm. Not the final, but the midterm. There's one essay question, and I've given you more time. I'm bumping up the total time. It's a time test, but it'll be a full 2 hours. I don't think you'll need all that time, but you can take it if you need it. I don't want you to spend all week taking a midterm exam, And it's open book, open Bible, open note, not open friend. So, but the questions are written in such a way that they focus on aspects of, some of the high points that we've talked about in lecture, So I'm not going to ask you for details on a map, because that's stuff you can look up, because it's open book and open notes. So, but they're concepts about, do you understand kind of what we talked about in lecture? So, but I throw in a few humor bits along the way. You may laugh out loud at some of the answers that I put in multiple choice questions. If you see if you laugh at something, it's probably not the right answer. And that's just me. I like to be kind of playful that way. So I think taking an exam should be fun and enjoyable, and a celebration of what you've learned, right? It's just me. Did y'all get that out there? All right. Well, you got did you record that? Yes. Oh, good. Okay. Let's move on and finish out. We've got a few things to talk about before we finish Exodus. Now we're leaving the text a little bit, and I just want to focus on this discussion on covenants and the nature of covenants, because we've talked about a few major covenants so far. We've talked about the Abrahamic covenant. We didn't talk much about the Noahic covenant. Now we're back to another significant covenant, the Sinai covenant. And scholars have a lot to say as they've studied the covenants, the biblical covenants, as they compare. Am I on? Okay, I just saw a few. Sorry. Scholars will compare the biblical covenants with covenants that exist in the ancient world. And we've hinted on this a little bit, but I just wanted to focus on the two basic types of covenants. And you've got the basic elements of each. Basically, we've got a grant and a treaty, two different kinds of covenants. And in a grant covenant, we talk about the languages of the suzerain vassal. So that's the greater king, lesser king. The suzerain makes a covenant with the vassal, or commitment. Represents an obligation of the master to his vassal. So in the grant, the suzerain he obligates himself, like what God does with Abraham. I promise to do A, B, and C. Primarily protects the rights of the vassal. And then no major demands are made by the superior party. So scholars like to talk about the unconditional aspects of this kind of covenant. No strings attached. I'll make the case that it's not as clean and dry as that as we move ahead. Now the treaty covenant is what would be, scholars would talk more about the conditional covenant. So the suzerain imposes obligation on the vassal. Now in the ancient world, this would have been a little more harsh. But in the language of the Bible, we're talking about instruction. Obligation for feet attached to a heart that's given her allegiance, right? That's what we're talking about. Represents an obligation of the vassal to his master. Again, that's the same. Primarily protects the rights of the master. That's not so. What we see here, not so much that God's covenant with Israel is protecting God's rights, but it's protecting his reputation. Not as so much his rights, but how does God have a right to be rightly represented on planet Earth, so to speak, through the obedience and through the general wholehearted obedience of a nation? That's kind of the question there. And then master promises to reward or punish. So there are stipulations, blessings and curses attached to the ancient covenants. And we're going to see that as we move ahead in some of the further legislation. Moses is going to detail out the kinds of things that could happen if God has to respond that way in response to the disobedience or the infidelity that would be expressed by his nation. So if we look at the Abrahamic covenant first, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is kind of detailed. But basically the Abrahamic covenant and all of its expressions through the patriarchal line, it's pretty much the same. We saw, if you remember in Genesis, we looked at that. A lot of the same basic language. The promise of land, the promise of seed, and the promise of blessing. I will bless you. You will be a blessing to others. And what's interesting about this foundation, the Abrahamic covenant, is how we see it become the foundation for what's going to happen down the road. Next semester, when we get into the failure of Israel, the failed monarchy, bad king after bad king, we're going to ask ourselves, why would God be obligated to do anything now? And he does. And we're going to see that in the Davidic covenant. God's not through with Israel. God's not through with the kingdom or the king idea. And we're going to see when the prophets start to kick in, prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, we're going to see language that comes in. And if you're talking about a covenant, God's going to bring about a new covenant, one that can't fail, and one that's wired a little differently. It's going to speak of a new heart in the people, a circumcised heart, and some of that language that we'll see when we get to the prophets. But all of it stems from this unconditional foundation of the Abrahamic covenant. And by the way, that's going to get us to the day of the Lord. It's going to get us all the way to the end. Because some of these things that God's obligated to do, we have not seen the fullness of the fulfillment yet. We're waiting for the fulfillment of some of these things. So that's the exciting thing for us. So this does have relevance to us. All right. So that's the grant. That's the Abrahamic covenant. And when I do an analysis of the Abrahamic covenant, this is just my own observations. There's still some conditional aspects wrapped up in what we see in the text. So while these are the unconditional aspects that we've just seen, those basically come from the previous slide, there's still some conditional aspects that we see of course, if Abraham if he just sat on his chair all day and did nothing, and there was no feet attached, we wouldn't be where we are today, right? He had to follow through and do something. So he went. That's somewhat conditional. God promises all these things, but Abraham still got to follow through. The command to walk before me and be blameless, God gives to Abraham. And we know that wasn't a command for sinless perfection. Abraham, 5 steps forward, 3 steps back. But it was that wholehearted idea that I keep harping on, right? And I hope you see that. That was the idea for Abraham. So there's some conditionality there. There's feet attached to this whole thing. Abraham has to walk. He has to demonstrate obedience. We see in the oath in Genesis 22, comes in response to what Abraham has just demonstrated with feet attached to his heart in the pivotal chapter 22. And this idea is extended to Abraham's whole household. They all have to demonstrate fidelity as well. So there's conditionality wrapped up with the unconditional foundation of the Abrahamic covenant. So if we look at and evaluate the Mosaic covenant, which is, I would argue, the combination of what we saw in Exodus 19 and 20, usually we think of the stipulations, the Ten Commandments, but what happens before in chapter 19, right? The exchanging of words, the declaration of status. And by the way, I didn't cover this, but the passage that we looked at in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, for we are His workmanship. You all know that word workmanship comes from the Greek word poema, and where we get our English word poem. It's really, I think, another theologically rich. So I make the connection of Paul's Greek word poema. We are His poema. Connect that to segulah, the Hebrew word, or the special treasure idea that Moses uses. So I always talk about if you get Paul and Moses together in a Starbucks, sitting around having coffee. Yeah, you used a really good word there, Paul. Y'all know what word I used, and Paul would say, yeah, Moses, I like your word too, It all meant the same thing. Our unique status that God has defined us after we've been saved. So this conditionality. Let's go back to the Exodus. We've seen this slide before. Now we're talking about the Sinai covenant, which scholars generally like to pigeonhole here with this conditional. Everything's conditional. If this, then this. But I just want to remind us of some of the language that if we bring in chapter 19 with chapter 20 and understand it. It's on the foundation, and it's there in the text. We looked at verse 4. This covenant is enacted on the fact of God's salvation activity. He's bringing this, He's selecting Israel, He's saving them and bringing them to Himself. Verse 5, if we go back to Exodus 19 and look at verse 5, I just want to show you one thing there. Exodus 19, verse 5. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. There's the word covenant that's mentioned in verse 5. And what covenant does that refer to? See? I think that goes back to the foundation of the Abrahamic covenant. If you obey my covenant. Because we haven't gotten to the 10 words coming off of Mount Sinai yet. That's the next chapter. So I think there's this foundation of the Abrahamic covenant. So that unconditional idea is woven into and wrapped into, I think, the Sinai covenant. You have kind of a melding together of covenants as we move forward in this ongoing expression of what are the implications of the fact that the holy God is now taking up residence in the camp. What does it look like now? What do we have to do with our feet? See, Moses has to identify that, and that's what we see happening from this point on. And then in verse 6, the implications of this, being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So this is not only the fact of choice, but also, I say, the implication of choice. Israel is the vassal of the sovereign king, and that's an unconditional declaration that has future implications. So I think that's the idea of the kind of unconditional, conditional, kind of woven together there. It's one thing for somebody to declare you or define you in a certain way, but to make it really true, you have to put feet to it and follow through with it. That's the power of good parenting. You help your children, you define who they are, and you remind them of the wonderful aspects of who they are, and then they go out and put feet to it, and then they're launched, It's kind of that way with what we're seeing here. So there's implications of this, and I'm leaping out here a little bit, but I do it because we're going to come back to this. This is a kind of a hinge point in the history of God's revelation to Israel, right here at Mount Sinai as we move ahead. And I'm just going to, lightly touch on this. Two eschatological questions emerge from this point on. And they're this. And they're in your notes if you want to go back and look at them. You don't have to write them all down. But when would Israel's status as Segulah be fully realized? So this special treasure idea, God declares or defines Israel as his special treasure. But if we know in the history of Israel, Israel's going to become tarnished pretty quick. She's going to go the way of idolatry. She's going to be sucked into the lures of the pagan practices around her. And, then we're going to have a series of failure with regards to the monarchy. Bad king after bad king. We get to David, but then the kingdom splits not long after that. And we've got this history of failure. So the question is, when will this happen, this Segulah, be fully realized? So there seems to be this future implication of that. Number two, when would Israel's status as kingdom of priests and holy nation be fully realized? So it's a declaration, it's a definition, but then when is it going to have the fullness of fulfillment? And the answer is, I think a lot of the answer to these two questions has to do with the future day of the Lord. So if these are unconditional things that God's laid out and set in hard concrete, we expect them to be some building to emerge built on this foundation in some future point. So there's some unconditional future implications of these promises, I think. And one of the things that as we move forward, we'll always want to keep track of the fact that any time in Israel's history, there's a faithful remnant. No matter how dark and chaotic things look like on the outside, and in the text, which we'll be looking at, we don't always hear about them, but there's a faithful remnant somewhere around that God's still keeping track of, because the promises are for them. So we'll see this especially when we get to our prophets. And the prophets are always going to be talking to two groups of people. For the majority of unfaithful, everybody over here, this side of the room, including you all over there, I'm sorry. You're a part of the majority of unfaithful, and the prophetic message to you all is God's judgment, but there's time to repent. So you need to turn your lives around. God's given you some time here. But to you over here, just you three, you're part of the faithful remnant. And you're huddled over here in the corner for a reason, because you're looking around the chaos around you and saying, has God given up on us? And the prophetic answer is always no, because there's some things that he has not brought to fullness yet and fulfillment. There's a day of the Lord that's coming for you. This is your day. It could be their day if they get their heart changed in the right way. But you all have been faithful all along. So the future is for you. God has not given up on you, and there's a future for you, future day that he's going to come and bring about these things in their fulfillment. So, and that's what we see in this next very complicated slide. I know, we'll come back to it. But I map out unconditional and conditionality. The unconditional promises, land, nation, blessing. I will be their God forever and ever, amen. There's a Christmas song that we hear a lot about that. Forever and ever, hallelujah, hallelujah. Kingdom of priests and holy nation. Those unconditional things are going to happen because they are tracking from the fact that God has promised those things. But then there's the conditional aspects of the covenant as we move ahead. What happens when Israel doesn't put feet to faith? What happens if they don't even have faith at all? If they've gone full pagan? If they've become more pagan than the pagan nations around them? Then what happens? What is God obligated to do? Does he give up on them or what? So this will help us explain when the failure happens during the kingdom, failed king, God's going to remind us once again in the midst of that, well, on the verge of that chaos. David was a great king, but he wasn't perfect. That there's going to be some things that God has still yet to do with regards to the seed. Remember the seed idea. God hasn't lost track of that. There's going to be one from the seed who will come and eventually deal with the problem once and for all. So these things kind of like branch out and then come back together, because the prophets will begin to, oh yes, faithful remnant, look, God's not forgotten these things for you. And the prophets will find the foundation in the Davidic covenant. These are things that God has promised that He'll bring about. All of these things together means that there's a future for us. And it's coming when there's this new covenant idea, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the future for Israel. There's going to be this future for Israel. Now that gets, could be another whole lecture on that. But so, despite the failure, we're going to see this fulfillment. This creates tension. It's tension in the text. But we're going to keep track of this because that helps us to understand. When you get bogged down trying to read through bad king after bad king after bad king and say, what am I doing this for? You have to remind yourselves, well, God's not through. He's got a plan. And you'll start to see bits and pieces of that showing up in the text. So that's what I wanted us to see there. All right, well, let's move ahead here. So we'll finish out and talk about the theology of what happens next in the text. And it's the tabernacle and the implication now of being declared a kingdom of priests. So Israel is going to put feet to the faith and express now what this means is where we're going to have church and how we're going to have church. And those are some of the details that we see that come out as we move ahead. So let's look at Exodus chapter 25, verses 8 and 9. So we see this sanctuary, the beginnings of the construction of the sanctuary or the tabernacle. Chapter 25, verse 8 and 9. And let them construct a sanctuary for me, that I may dwell or tabernacle among them, according to all that I am going to show you, as the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all of its furniture, just so you shall construct it. Just so, or just in this exact way, you shall construct it. Now it's kind of hidden a little bit, but here's what I like to do with this. Because Yahweh is now plopped right down in the midst of Israel, physically, this has long-reaching implications. Israel has now become the center of holiness for the world. And what's interesting is in the tabernacle and all of the details that we have, people often ask, why all the details of this construction of the tabernacle, this portable sanctuary? You've got kind of this is a rudimentary picture, but an eternal reality, earthly expression. What we'll find as we move forward is that there's some things that find earthly expression because they're eternal realities. So the tabernacle is one of those things. There's an eternal reality of the tabernacle, and it exists, and it's coming again, by the way. That's part of the day of the Lord. When the Lord comes back and establishes His tabernacle again, it's actually coming down in the new earth and the new heaven. But it finds temporarily, you might say, an earthly expression. So why are they having church this way? What are they going to do in this earthly representation of an eternal reality? They're going to deal with sin. And I'm going to argue when we get to the book of Leviticus that when they perform their sacrifices by faith with feet attached to it, they're engaging in an eternal reality of a lamb that's been slain from before the foundation of the world, in anticipation of the fact that the lamb will come and earthly represent the fact of what has eternally been true. Jesus will come and become the lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. But back then, by faith, Israel was able to express and engage in that reality. Does that make sense? Yes. So it's just a kind of a philosophical, not so deep, but it's just kind of a... So God does have... The details do matter. Does that make sense? Because they're trying to bring an earthly representation to an eternal reality. in the very details of their tabernacle and how it's built and how it's designed. Now let's bring in another aspect of the implications of all of this in terms of bearing the name. So this, as we've already seen, attaches us to one of those big ideas that we established from the very beginning, the idea of name. What does it mean to belong to Yahweh? His name is on His name, not my name, His name is on my t-shirt. Let's look at chapter 28. Chapter 28, verse 36 through 38. Is this right? Okay. Well, anyway, okay. You shall also make a plate of pure gold, and shall engrave on it, like the engravings of a seal, holy to the Lord. And you shall fasten it on a blue cord, and it shall be on the turban, it shall be at the front of the turban, and it shall be on Aaron's forehead. And Aaron shall take away the iniquity of the holy things which the sons of Israel consecrate with regard to all their holy gifts, and it shall always be on his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord. So that's just a small example of holy belonging to the Lord. This is something that becomes part of the actual the headgear. So Israel, the name of Yahweh is linked to all of this activity now that's being defined with regards to the priestly activity. The priests themselves, as well as Israel as a nation. If we look ahead to Deuteronomy, just a couple places, let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 7. So this is on the backside of the wilderness wandering, chapter 7, verse 6. And Moses is going to come back to this idea and remind them, now that they've gone through the wilderness experience. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for His segulah, His own special treasure, out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 2. Let's turn there. He again says, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for His own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And Deuteronomy 26, verses 18 through 19. And the Lord has today declared to you to be His people, a treasured possession. See how much repetition Moses gives to this idea. As He promised you, and that you should keep all of His commandments, and that He shall set you high above all the nations which He has made, for praise, fame, and honor, and that you shall be a consecrated, holy people to the Lord your God, just as He has spoken. So this is the idea. And this is the implication of the name idea. It kind of reminds us of the early conflicts that we saw way back in Genesis 1 through 11. Remember at the Tower of Babel? Come, let us make for ourselves a name. The people said in defiance. You know? And that thread, that sin and rebellion has kind of continued through the whole pagan expression. Now it's coming back, and Israel is now the nation who's going to hopefully change that. Instead of come let us make for ourselves a name, Israel is going to be come let us magnify the name, as we move ahead. So this special treasure idea is a significant idea as Moses continues to unpack it as we move through into the book of Deuteronomy, the capstone of the Pentateuch. And I talked about the segulah idea, the special treasure, the most precious thing out of all of the king's treasure house is this idea. Let's look at Deuteronomy, another passage in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 28. I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit to Deuteronomy. 28 verses 9 through 10. This is part of the blessing that Moses is laying out for Israel. Verse 8, we'll start there. The Lord will command the blessing upon you in your barns, and all that you put your put your hand to. And He'll bless you in the land which the Lord your God gives you. The Lord will establish you as a holy people to Himself, as He swore to you, referring back to Exodus 19. If you will keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in His ways. And that's the picture of the heart with feet. For the purpose, and we have it in verse 10, so it's the why. So all the peoples of the earth shall see that you are called by the name. See, there's the name of Yahweh. And they shall be afraid of you. They will fear in the right way, I think. And the Lord will make you abound in prosperity, in the offspring of your body, and the offspring of your beast, cows, lambs, llamas, and all the produce of your ground in the land which the Lord your God swore to your fathers to give you. So this all connects. So Israel's in a kind of a missional idea. There's a missional role attached to bearing the name Yahweh for Israel as they move ahead. So, and it's going to call for this special idea that we're talking about, special treasure, the Segulah, being defined as a kingdom of priests and holy nation. Let's just jump ahead. And if you ask any modern Jew on the street, they'll tell you this is the most important verse for any Jew is Deuteronomy chapter 6. So let's turn there. And this is the Shema. What does all of this mean for Israel? And Moses unpacks this in verse 4. Shema, O Israel. That's the word. Hear or obey. It's the same word that means two things. The Lord is our God. The Lord, His name, remember? The name, the Lord. Yahweh is our God. Yahweh is one. And they would pause and think to themselves, so what are the implications of this being in allegiance to this one God? This God who's introduced Himself by name, Yahweh. Verse 5, and you love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and with all your might. So singular of God means singular of allegiance. One heart, not hearts. One God means one heart. And then with feet attached to that. So this is what we're doing as we move ahead. All right, so I think another way to think about the idea of bearing the name, I spent a little time talking about this, the significance of bearing the name. It has geographical implications. You might think of it as Israel as a nation is now having to plant the flag, planting the flag in the Promised Land. They're going to do this, and I jump ahead to Deuteronomy chapter 12 as a significant passage. And here are the implications of what it means or what's going to happen as a result of planting the flag. Verses 1 through 5. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess as long as you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy, and here are the implications, all of the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains, and on the hills, and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, burn their asherim with fire, cut down their engraved images of their gods, and obliterate their name from that place. Battle over name. So the pagan reputation is well established and well entrenched in the Promised Land. So there's going to have to be, in a sense, a divine or a cosmic battle. Again, not with an Egyptian pharaoh, but now there's going to be pagan nations. So verse 4, you shall not act this way to Yahweh your God, verse 5, but you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God shall choose from all your tribes to establish His name there for His dwelling, and there you shall come. So there's going to be a special place for the planting of the flag Yahweh. This eventually will be the permanent residence, and that's the temple. That'll be take the place of the tabernacle. down the road. So yeah, this sounds a little mean and a little, wow, this causes, battles. There'll be some battles fought. We'll get to Joshua and talk about that. But but behind all of this is the name of Yahweh versus the name of the whatever pagan god you want to pick. And we already know, and Moses is warning Israel, that already in the land there's pagan expression. And we look at some of the details we'll see later. Infant sacrifice, the devaluation of the image of God, the value of the human being, pagan temple prostitution, male, female, redefinition of sexual roles and identities. It's all there in Pagansville. And this is where Israel, this is God's land. This is His land. This is where His name and reputation needs to be established. So there's going to be conflict that's just around the corner for Israel. All right? So there's a lot of emphasis, and we won't go there, but there's a lot of places in Deuteronomy that talk about the place that Yahweh, the Lord, will choose to establish His name. Deuteronomy 12:5, verse 11, verse 21, chapter 14, chapter 16, and all chapter 26. And as a thread throughout Deuteronomy, the battle will come over the place and establishment of His name. I don't know if I want to, just briefly talk about, I've done a little looking at the activity of some of the implications of the name and what it means when they put feet to it. So the implications of putting feet. And in these verses, we won't have time to look up a lot of them. But I just want to maybe highlight at this point some of the kinds of activities. Seeking Yahweh, seeking the face of Yahweh, reading and hearing the Torah, learning to fear Yahweh, rejoicing before the Lord, so worship and eating before the Lord, and then celebrating before the Lord, before the name Yahweh. So the name Yahweh has implications really comprehensive with respect to all the details of the nitty-gritty of how Israel is expressing themselves for eating, worshiping, learning, celebration. I want to focus on just maybe that one. That's why I put it in red. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 16. Deuteronomy 16. And some of the instruction on this particular feast, and verses 13 through 17. You shall celebrate, starting in verse 13. You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths 7 days after you have gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat, and you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, and your male and female servants, and the Levite, and notice this, and the stranger, people outside from other cities, and the orphan and the widow who are in your towns. 7 days you shall celebrate a feast to the Lord your God in the place which the Lord chooses, because in the Lord your God will bless you and all your produce and all your work and all your hands, so that you all of you shall be altogether joyful. So that's the idea here. Then we get into some other things there. But these feasts were interesting, that they focus on the name and the reputation of Yahweh. Yahweh, the name of Yahweh was to be front stage and center, and by way of remembering these things in celebration and in response to the bounty that God has provided for His people. So largely they're focused on, kind of the cycle of the harvest, planting and harvest seasons. We'll look at that more as we get ahead. But just to wrap up, the tabernacle, portable, very ornate, but very specifically designed. And if we go back to Exodus, beginning in chapter 25, all the way through chapter 31, lots of chapters, lots of detail given to how this thing was constructed for the priesthood, and we'll get to it in Leviticus, the sacrificial system that was going to be part of the expression that goes on here. Its basic design, as you know, two major compartments, the inner court and the outer court, with the holy place and then the Holy of Holies, the most holy place with regards to the Day of Atonement and that once a year sacrifice. We'll talk more about it when we get to Leviticus to talk about the Day of Atonement that took place in dealing with sin. The faithful in Israel were engaged in the outer court burnt offerings, but they would go there as an act of faith with feet attached to it to deal with sin. And we'll talk about that when we get to Leviticus. But this is a place that was significant in its design and what it was intended to do, because I think it represented an earthly expression of an eternal reality. And that's why the details are significant. And the big question is, how is Israel going to deal with sin? Not sinless perfection, but they're dealing with sin. And as a whole heart of faithful response, Moses is going to define that out for them. And it's going to be called the sacrificial system. So it's interesting, to be a faithful Israelite cost you something. You were having to sacrifice and engage in this sacrificial system. Well, I'm 2 slides short. We're going to talk about the failure. The golden calf had to happen just around the corner. Just when the church bus left the parking lot, something happens, right? It's always that way. It's always that way. You get the flat tire in the first mile of leaving for your family vacation. So we'll have to save the golden calf for next time. And we'll pick up and get into Leviticus, and I'm sure we'll get into Numbers and get ourselves caught up a little bit. I talked about just in 20 seconds, some of you may have been out. I talked a little bit about the final exam, the midterm, sorry. If you follow my email, make sure you read that, and in the announcement that I post. My basic encouragement is to use the speaker notes in your PowerPoint slides. If you want to go back and review and just slightly read through and refamiliarize yourself with the concepts we've talked about here in class on the book of Genesis. It's open book, open note, but you might want to, if you can, print off slides. You can highlight and get yourself ready so that you can open up and say, okay, he's asking me one of those I've got to really think about this question, make sure I understand it, and then, oh, yeah, there's the obvious right answer, and you'll move through. I'm giving you an extra time, a full 2 hours to take the test. So anytime this week, you can go in and do that. Open Bible, open note, open book, not open friend, so it's not team. Take it with a teammate. You can't do that. So you're master's level students. This is all about you and your preparation.